University Liberal Club Sunday Sessions. I'm your host, Rory O'Connor, and I have with me my co-host, Andrew Brennan.
Hello, Rory. Good to see you.
Good to see you too, legend. Tonight's discussion is The Forgotten Menzies, Understanding Australian Liberal Conservatism, and our guest speaker is Dr. Stephen Chavura. How are you?
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
No worries. Thanks so much for coming and giving us this fantastic presentation. When you're ready.
Thank you very much. Well, like I said, it's an honor to be here, and it's even better actually to know that there are some people, particularly some younger people out there who are interested in the life and the career and the legacy of Sir Robert Menzies, Australia's longest serving Prime Minister. I'm Stephen Chavura. I teach history at Campion College here in Sydney. And I wrote this book, The Forgotten Menzies, the world picture of Australia's longest serving Prime Minister, with a good friend of mine and a great Australian historian, Professor Greg Meluish at the University of Wollongong. It's a real honor to do that. Any time writing and working with Greg is an honor because one learns so much from him. He's just got such a capacious and sharp mind. This project sort of came about by accident in that, Greg and I and me and some others were working on some other projects, and it appeared like it would be a good idea to actually have a look at Menzies' social ideas to contribute to other projects that we were working on. And I discovered there are about 500 boxes of the Menzies papers at the National Library of Australia. And going through his speeches and his pamphlets and his books, I realized that this was actually a very, very interesting thinker. And he said some very interesting things about his age. And we realized that there's an article in all of this. And then we realized when we started writing the article that there's a book. And so this is the book that I'll be talking about today. And what I want to talk about today, ladies and gentlemen, is really the worldview of Sir Robert Menzies and what he meant by things like liberalism and essentially what his political worldview was. Before that, just a brief note on Menzies the man. So Menzies was born in 1894. So he's born when Queen Victoria is still alive. He's born before Australia becomes a federated nation. So he's born actually in a colony. He's born in the colony of Victoria in a small town called Japarit. When he's a young boy, his father, who is a coach painter, decides to pack the family up and they move to Ballarat. And his mother and father open up a local shop in Ballarat. So Menzies himself was not from a privileged upbringing at all. He was from what we might call something like a sort of a lower middle class family. There are stories of him as a child when there was a severe windstorm going through Ballarat, him remembering his house rocking from side to side. So again, this was not a child brought up in wealth. And Menzies, in all earthly respects at least, was certainly what we could call a self-made man, although he had very, very good and conscientious parents. His father at one point went into politics. His father was also a lay preacher in the local churches. And so you sort of get an idea of where his interest in politics came from, his brilliant sort of capacity as a public speaker. Now, when he's about 13 years old, Menzies actually tops the whole state of Victoria in the sort of the primary school exams. He gets the #1 mark in Victoria and is allowed to go to any high school he wants. And so he goes to a private high school and then he wins another scholarship and eventually wins a full scholarship to go to Melbourne University. And he starts Melbourne University in 1914. And anyone who knows anything about history knows that 1914 was quite a year. And of course, Menzies himself does not go to World War I, which was something that stigmatized him for the rest of his life. In fact, when he became Prime Minister in 1939 and actually declared that Australia was going to war with Germany, many people said he was unfit for office because he was too cowardly to fight in World War I. Well, in actual fact, it wasn't that he was too cowardly at all. He was a university student. He had a brother. I think he may have had another family member who went. It was very common for one boy to stay home. But anyhow, that was an interesting age, and it was something that dogged him by his enemies for many, many years. He loved his university years, and he did absolutely outstandingly. He becomes, of course, a lawyer. He very, very famously in his 20s successfully defends a case known as the Engineers case before the High Court of Australia and wins. So he's an absolute prodigy as a lawyer. And then in the year 1929 goes into Victorian state politics. The following decade, he goes into federal politics. By 1939, when he's in his early 40s, or his mid 40s, he is Prime Minister of Australia. It doesn't go very well, and he steps down as Prime Minister for the sake of his party, the United Australia Party. And everyone thinks that Menzies is done, that he's forgotten, he's yesterday's man. But of course, as we all know, 10 years later in 1949, after he'd helped form the Liberal Party 5 years earlier, in fact, he wins office with the Liberal Party, becomes Prime Minister, and is Prime Minister from 1949 to 1966. An unprecedented length of time in the history of Australian politics. The only person who doesn't even really come close, to be honest, is John Howard, who's in for 11 years. And that's the closest anyone has come. So pretty remarkable stuff. Now, what animated Menzies? And this is really sort of the focal point of this particular book. We wrote the book to a large extent with a current debate that's taking place in the Liberal Party in mind. And that debate is sort of about, well, what is, who is the Liberal Party? Ideologically, what is the Liberal Party? Is it progressive? Is it conservative? What does liberal mean? And very often people are going back to Robert Menzies, one of the founders, obviously, to find out exactly what he meant by a Liberal Party, what he meant by progressive. If you don't mind, I'll just read a couple of paragraphs from the book that nicely sort of set up the thesis of the book. Here it goes. I'm reading from pages 2 to 3. In recent times, the Liberal Party has attempted to reclaim the Menzies heritage and to portray him as the fount of the liberal values of the modern Liberal Party. This has been a welcome antidote to the caricature of Menzies, which has often been projected by their political opponents, but which has also expressed certain confusions of its own. Most famously, in 2017, Liberal Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull stated that neither Menzies nor the Liberal Party were ever, quote, conservative, end quote. In his speech, Turnbull quoted the line in Menzies' autobiography, Afternoon Light, in which Menzies explained why he called his party the Liberal Party rather than the Conservative Party. He quotes Menzies, quote, "We took the name Liberal because we were determined to be a progressive party, willing to make experiments, in no sense reactionary, but believing in the individual, his right and his enterprise, and rejecting the socialist panacea," end quote. Political scientist and columnist Peter Van Onselen defended Turnbull's view of Menzies, reprinting that Menzies quote above and glossing, quote, "Take the opportunity to reread that quote," says Van Onselen, reminding yourself how often Menzies is incorrectly referred to as a champion of conservatism. Determined to be a progressive party. Not a lot of ambiguity in that, end quote, says Van Onselen. But no serious reading of Menzies' speeches and writings would support Turnbull's or Van Onselen's analyses. Indeed, it's a pity that neither Turnbull nor Van Onselen seem to have read other sections of the book from which they lifted that quote. For example, in the same book, Afternoon Light, Menzies reflected on his childhood debates with his beloved uncle, John Sampson, who, unlike Menzies, was a socialist. Looking back from his early 70s, Menzies could say that even, quote, "even then, I suppose I was an instinctive conservative." I'll read that quote from Menzies again. "Even then, I suppose I was an instinctive conservative. So Menzies himself actually did identify as a conservative. He also identified as a liberal, and he wanted his party to be understood as liberal and progressive. Now, why didn't he call it a conservative party? We've got to remember that the word conservatism in Australia is basically a dirty word right up until the 1990s. Why? Because conservatism throughout colonial history in most people's minds tended to mean that you wanted to re-establish all the old institutions of England just the way they were then, but over here. So what did a conservative want to conserve? Well, a landed aristocracy, overturn democracy maybe, and just bring back the aristocracy being able to vote, to reintroduce the Church of England as the only official church. So conservatism in the colonial period was not a word that people generally used to describe themselves, even if they were, in many respects, conservative, in the sense that they believed in the traditions of England being very good guides for policy. They believed in tradition itself as something that was very good. They believed that the British heritage, that British laws, that British rights were very good. And also they believed in social change, but not revolutionary and radical social change. And so in actual fact, and Greg and I have written another article for the Australian Journal of Political Science on the conservative ideas that animated a lot of the people behind Federation. And what we found is, in actual fact, the influence of Edmund Burke and conservative thinking throughout Australian history is actually very strong. And it's certainly evident in Robert Menzies. But you would generally not call yourself a conservative in Australia because it tended just to mean reactionary. So I guess what I'm saying is, even though a lot of people in Australia right up until Menzies did not label themselves conservatives, the basic animating principles of conservatism were still very strong in a lot of these people, and they were quite strong also in Menzies. But again, the thesis of this book is that if you want to understand what Menzies meant when he sort of called himself a conservative, which he did at least once, and what he meant by liberalism, the best way to understand that is to understand Menzies in his own time. How did Menzies use the term liberalism? How did he use the term freedom? And what we find is that the way Menzies used these terms was quite different to the way that many people might use them today. We might be interrupted in a second by an unwanted visitor. Get away. Get out of here. Goodness sakes. This is it. The libertarians are trying to crash us. All right. Menzies did not get his definitions of liberalism or conservatism from any textbook. So the best way to understand where Menzies was coming from is really just to go through a bunch of things that were really, really dear to him. Just excuse me. Okay. One of the things dearest to Menzies' heart was the idea of Britishness. At the end of the day, Menzies identified himself as a British Australian or an Australian Brit. And nowadays, it's very common to sort of laugh at Menzies for being so attached to Great Britain. But what we need to understand is that Australians in general were very attached to Great Britain. Remember, Menzies was born in 1894. Right up into the 1980s, Australia is actually still very, very British. I remember growing up in the 80s, and when you watched comedy shows, you definitely had American comedy shows, no doubt about that. But you also had a lot of British television on as well. And we've another interesting thing about Australia is that, when something scandalous happens with the cricket, ball tampering, or with the sad death of the young Philip Hughes, I believe his name was, I actually don't follow sports, but Australia sort of stands still and pays attention to these things, which indicates, in a way that America doesn't, for example, which indicates there is a strong British strand still in us. And so Menzies was really echoing sort of the spirit of his own time in Australia. People were British, and the British Empire was the greatest empire that the world had ever seen. And just sort of ethnically speaking, even though you have a lot of immigration from Eastern Europe from the late 1940s onwards, still for the most part, Australia is overwhelmingly British. And so to look at Menzies' love affair with Britain and Britishness and see it as weird is very unfair. And it's what a historian would call anachronistic. We're sort of misplacing our own values back in time on his and judging him by our own values and by our own identity today. But very importantly, for Menzies, and for most other people who believed in Britishness, Britishness was not about race. It was not about being white. What it was about institutions and traditions. So to be a proud Brit meant that you were a proud custodian, and this is very Burkean, a proud custodian of institutions, traditions, and very importantly, virtues and character traits like reasonableness, like compromise, like to being more willing to discuss than to enter into fights, that you believed had characterized Britain from the Magna Carta onwards. So to be British was not so much about race. It was about civic virtues and civic institutions that you believed had evolved uniquely in the British tradition, and that you basically believed had proven to be the best institutions that the human mind had ever come up with. And also a cultural and literary legacy as well, Shakespeare, for example. And so that was very, very dear to Menzies' heart, sort of Britishness. And the other thing that Menzies really imbibed as a young man, and that was also quite pervasive in Australia and also in Great Britain, and by Great Britain, yeah, I mean England, Wales, and Scotland, and Ireland's a bit different, of course. Ireland is Catholic. Obviously, the North is Protestant and Presbyterian, but Ireland is Catholic, of quite a different culture in some ways. I don't want to exclude them, but there is something different about them. And I don't mean that in any derogatory sense. But another thing that he imbibed was this thing that historians call cultural Puritanism, which was a form of Christianity, particularly a form of Protestantism, although it's not necessarily incompatible with Catholicism, but it was basically a cultural impulse that placed a very heavy emphasis on the individual doing one's duty to one's family and to one's community, and what is one's, and it privileges duties over rights. Maybe the last great expression of it was actually, ironically, by a Catholic, and that was Sir Robert Kennedy, President John F. Kennedy, who said, ask not what your nation can do for you, but what you can do for your nation. That was kind of this link, this sense that being a citizen is not about rights; it's about duties. And Menzies believed that very, very strongly. I'll read a quote from Menzies from the book, which nicely sort of captures what we mean by cultural Puritanism. And so it emphasizes duties over rights. It emphasizes individuality over individualism. And so individualism is kind of, I'm going to do what's good for me. I'm not going to break the law. I'm not going to violate your rights. But if what's good for me is not good for you, to hell with you. Menzies was against that kind of thing. He believed in individuality. And by that, he meant basically being able to stand on your own 2 feet, to be able to support yourself, to be a lifter and not a leaner, in his words. And for Menzies, it was very important that once you can stand on your own feet, at that point, what you need to start doing is looking around your community and seeing, what can I do to help my community? So it wasn't individualistic. It was a very outward-centered kind of philosophy that he had, which was strongly related to the Christianity that he professed. And again, something that historians sort of call cultural Puritanism. Here's a good quote on it from page 56 of the book. And this is from a speech he gave called The Task of Democracy. He writes, the best and strongest community is not that in which everybody looks to his neighbor, hoping for something from him, but that in which everyone looks to his neighbor, willing and able to do something for him. In brief, we achieve the good of man when we help and encourage him to be a man, strong, self-reliant, intelligent, independent, sympathetic, and generous. One of Menzies' great fears, as we'll see, is that the duties of human beings towards one another over time start to become taken up by the state. And the state starts looking after individuals and looking after families. And for Menzies, there were several dangers with that. One of them is that we start to worship the state. We start to see allegiance to the state as the chief end of what it is to be a human being. And the other thing that Menzies really worried about is that over time, because we kind of know that the state will just look after people, we stop caring about people. We stop feeling any obligations to people. Why? Well, because we know that the state will take care of them. And so Menzies thought that it'll lead to a kind of a sort of citizenship without any individuals who have a sense of obligation to one another, and also a citizenship that focuses more on our rights against the state and our rights against one another, as opposed to our duties. And Menzies was a liberal, and he did talk about freedom, but again, for Menzies, he really didn't like talking about freedom and rights for too long. He would normally end any discussion on freedom and rights by actually talking about duties to one another. He was very, very duty-centric in the way he thought. I can read another quote from him. He's talking about freedom here. This is from a speech he gave. He writes, and Menzies, look, Menzies was a brilliant, sharp legal thinker. He was not a philosopher. He was a very interesting thinker, but his greatest gift was he had this way of being able to speak and write in a way that was absolutely inspiring. He was probably the greatest speaker and writer of any prime minister in Australian history, and up there in the top 3 smartest, most learned Australian prime ministers. The top 3 are Alfred Deakin, Robert Menzies, and Gough Whitlam. They're the top 3. And Menzies is certainly within the top 3. I would say he's probably second to Alfred Deakin. He writes here, freedom is not a commodity you buy over a counter. It is a principle of life. It must be strong to resist its enemies. It is a source of power, not something passive or dead. My right to be free imposes on me obligations of the most absolute kind to defend my freedom. And so if I'm to have freedom from want, I must pay the price of that freedom. I must work and strive. And so for Menzies, to be free is to basically be free from free from want. So you don't have to rely on some other person or some other institution for the things that you need to survive and flourish. But then that imposes a massive obligation on me. Then to be free really means for me to have the ability to strive and work hard to get the things that I need, that I don't have to depend on anyone else, especially the state. And Menzies' great fear, particularly in the 1950s and the 1940s and 50s, was that if the Labor Party got into power, it would basically bring Australia down the track of socialism, which would over time make Australians very dependent on the state. They'd lose a love of freedom. And basically his fear was that with socialism, people would become so used to getting what they need from the state that they would sort of lose a sense of individuality, and they basically start seeing the state as a father, not to be questioned. They would basically lose any sense of individual initiative, and it would basically corrupt the sort of the British character as he understood it. So there's a sense in which, to sum that bit up, for Menzies' approach to freedom was not so much in the line of John Stuart Mill. It was more in the line of Edmund Burke. Another thing that really characterized Menzies' was, again, he did think that communism was a serious threat, but communism was a threat for two reasons. He believed that obviously a communist government basically makes everyone the slave of the state. It makes everyone the slave of the communist state. And so in that respect, Menzies was a great advocate of what we might these days call civil society. That is, the things that we need to flourish as human beings, friendships, food, education, literature, these things as much as possible should be provided by institutions free from the state. Although he did actually expand the state's involvement in education, which I suppose at the time seemed like a good idea. And Menzies' great critique of communism, first and foremost, was that it basically just sees individuals as cogs in a greater machine and that can be sacrificed if need be. But second, that for Menzies, communism was materialistic in the sense that it rejected God, and therefore rejected any foundation that humans could have any dignity and any foundation for what we might call human equality. It was a very common idea in the 40s and 50s that equality can only be made sense of if you presuppose Christian ideas. And for Menzies, the only thing that makes sense of the foundation of democracy, that we're all equal, is that we're all created equally by God. For Menzies, that's the only real foundation. You're not going to find it in Darwinian science, any notion of equality. You're not going to find it in science at all. Science says nothing about human equality. In fact, science teaches the exact opposite, that some are weak and some are strong, some are smart, some are not. It doesn't teach equality at all. For Menzies, it's a theological, religious concept. And therefore, for Menzies, the greater traction Marxism has, and the worse religion fares socially, the more corroded the foundations of democracy become. But also Menzies was afraid of another kind of materialism, and that is sort of where we become materialistic in the sense that we become so wealthy and prosperous in the West that we stop caring about the spiritual things of life. We stop caring about God. We stop caring about high culture. We stop caring about our own freedom. And all we care about is satiating our desire for entertainment, our desire for the next dopamine hit. And that really worried him as well. And on that note, Menzies thought that a really good institution to support would be the universities. Menzies thought that the universities might be the savior of civilization. Interestingly, he thought the universities are not the churches. I don't know why that is. Maybe he did think that the churches could play a big role, but he just didn't talk about it that much. I'm not sure. But Menzies very famously expanded the university sector and kind of idealized the universities as these sort of homes of culture, homes of preserving sort of sweetness and light, as one defender of high culture in the 19th century, Matthew Arnold, called it. So for Menzies, what will stop Australia from becoming just a sort of a cultural backwater where people only care about Netflix, beer, and reality television and sport? What will stop us from doing that? A university system that produces great cultural elites. And so for Menzies, he expands the universities, he gives them unprecedented funding, he puts many, many more people through universities, either for free or with heavily subsidized fees. All with the aim of creating, really, quite frankly, a cultured, educated, bureaucratic elite. And that was a very common thing to want to do after World War II, all around the world. So he was a great friend of the universities, but the problem with Menzies is that he seriously underestimated the extent to which the universities themselves and intellectuals were moving away from his own vision of what good culture was and what universities should be there to do. So Menzies sees universities as in two respects. Number one, they should basically train people to be clear-thinking technocrats in government to solve difficult problems regarding technology and things like that, which you need. Second, universities should be teaching people about Western civilization about the great literature, the great art, so that will be preserved into the future. Certainly universities stayed on track with the technocrat thing, and they became homes of engineering and science and that kind of thing. But they also, around the time of the 50s and 60s, were increasingly adopting Marxism. Menzies could sort of see it happening, but he really underestimated the extent to which it would take over the university. So there's a funny thing, and well, not funny, but Menzies actually funded the very institutions that over time would undermine the very Australia that he wanted to produce. Look, let me one final thing, and I'm sure there are a million things I haven't spoken about that you're interested in, you can ask me about them, but just one thing in terms of his legacy. In some respects, I mean, the book is a little bit pessimistic about Menzies' legacy, which isn't sort of a pessimism or a critique of Menzies himself. It's really a critique of Australia. Because Menzies' great project, which we argue in this book, was really to sort of revive cultural puritanism in Australia, so that Australians didn't become so dependent on the state, that Australians really saw their destiny in their own efforts and not in what the government can do for us. And in that respect, if that was what Menzies' great project was, then he failed, because that is not actually where Australia wound up going. Australia wound up becoming increasingly secularized. So it started to care less and less about religion. In Australia, the state started getting bigger and bigger and bigger, particularly under Whitlam and then onwards. In Australia, the Britishness declined. The Britishness is something that declined, and maybe that was inevitable. But to say that Menzies' greatest goal was something that he failed at is really not a critique of Menzies. It's actually a condemnation of modern Australia in some ways, because what it really meant is that Australians stopped caring about their heritage. They stopped caring about individual initiative, started looking more and more towards the state, and stopped caring about culture, and started just caring more about television, Netflix, and whether there's enough Coopers in the fridge. But in terms of Menzies' achievements, well, they're pretty undeniable for any sort of fair-minded person. And his achievements were, and many of them are still very important today, like the ANZUS Treaty of 1951, where Menzies he sees that Great Britain is the past. If Australia is going to be secure in Asia, it needs to have a treaty with America. So you've got the ANZUS Treaty, which is appearing to us nowadays more important than ever with the rise of China. He opened up trade with Asia. He did this before. I mean, Keating always used to say that he did it. No, Menzies actually did it. He opened up massive trade with Japan. Expanding the universities, that was a huge accomplishment of him, notwithstanding many of the massive problems that universities have today. He basically initiated a golden age of the universities in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, which started to decline in the later 80s, but it was a golden age. He started funding to denominational schools, which I think is not a bad thing. Although there are good arguments, that we need more schooling detached, well, from state control, maybe not necessarily state funding. He also helped manage one of the most prosperous periods in Australian history. And interestingly, also, Menzies was a great advocate of women going into politics. And here's an interesting thing. It would seem that actually women really liked Menzies in the early Liberal Party, that he seemed kind of progressive. He was never a second wave feminist. He was never a feminist, but he knew that women were increasingly going to enter all sorts of new sectors in society. He didn't criticize it. He said, this is the way it's going to be. Things are changing. He encouraged them to go into politics. And also, when you read his great speech, The Forgotten People, and if you want to do anything after this, go and read his speech, The Forgotten People. It's not a long speech. He gave it in 1942. It's available for free online. Read it, and you'll see that very central to Menzies' idea of sort of the true Australia is the home. For Menzies, true Australia is not in the workplace, like Labor would say. It's in the home. And that really appealed to women in the 40s and the 50s, because that made them central to Menzies' vision of Australia, the home. I think that's enough for now. Thank you very much for paying attention, guys.